All right, let's dive into something kind of unexpected. Okra stew. Might be thinking, okra stew? Really? But trust me, you'll learn a lot, and who knows? Might be craving a bowl by the end. We're looking at a YouTube tutorial by Sweet Adjeley.
Okay.
And she promises, like, a seriously good recipe.
Right.
So to help us break down all the cooking stuff and the cultural stuff, we've got our expert here.
Happy to be here. What jumps out right away is how Sweet Adjeley really leans into the slimy or like dry texture of okra.
Yeah.
So for anyone who hasn't cooked with it much, this is like a classic thing with okra dishes.
Right. It's almost like she's saying, love that slime. She even says, like, if you add crab, you've hit the jackpot.
Uh-huh.
Clearly, she's all about that texture.
Yeah.
But why do some people love that and others, like, can't stand it?
So that slime is from a soluble fiber in okra called mucilage. Gets released when you cook it. It's kind of like what makes chia seeds gel up, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Some people think that texture's great, others not so much. Sweet Adjeley does have a tip if you're not into super gooey stew. More tomatoes can make it less slimy.
So you can actually control the slime level. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Let's get to the flavor, though. Sweet Adjeley's recipe is all about building those layers of taste.
Yeah.
She starts by pre-cooking the meat and cow foot. It seems like a crucial first step.
Totally. Pre-cooking gets more flavor out of the meat, and the cow foot makes a richer broth for the stew. It's like building the foundation for a flavor symphony.
Ooh, I like that analogy. Makes me think about how I cook and if I could use that technique too. So what instruments are in this flavor symphony then?
Well, we've got a spice blend cube, some habanero peppers for that heat, and then a dash of shrimp powder for like a hit of umami.
That spice blend cube has me curious. It's not something I've used.
Yeah.
What's actually in it? And how does it change the whole flavor profile?
Spice blend cubes are pretty common in West African cooking. They usually have a mix of dried herbs and spices, often garlic, ginger, chili peppers, and sometimes even fermented stuff like locust beans.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a pre-made flavor bomb ready to add depth to anything you're cooking.
Wow. Sounds complex.
Yeah.
So you have the base flavors from the meat and cow foot, then this multi-layered spice blend, the heat from the habaneros, and the umami from the shrimp powder.
Right.
That's a lot going on. Is there a risk the spice blend, like, overpowers the other flavors?
It's a good question, but it seems like Sweet Adjeley's got the amounts just right for a balanced flavor. And remember, she tells people to adjust the habaneros to their own taste, because everyone's got a different spice tolerance.
That's a good point. Cooking should be about making the dish your own, not just following a recipe blindly. But before we move on to everything else, let's not forget the main star, the okra itself. Sweet Adjeley adds ginger paste to the boiling okra, and it got me thinking, is there more to okra than just that unique texture?
Oh, definitely. Okra is really nutritious, packed with fiber, which is, good for digestion, and it might even help control blood sugar levels.
So this stew isn't just tasty, it's healthy too.
Yep.
I feel like that gets overlooked when people think about okra. Now there's one step that had me wondering. Sweet Adjeley adds baking soda while boiling the okra, but that part of the video cut out, so we don't know why.
Interesting. That's actually a common kitchen hack for okra. Baking soda can help keep that bright green color while cooking, and it can also make that slimy texture stronger.
Oh, so it's another way to control that slime factor.
Exactly.
But isn't there a downside to using baking soda in cooking? Doesn't it sometimes mess with the flavor?
You're right to be careful. Too much baking soda can definitely change the flavor of a dish. It reminds you that kitchen hacks can be helpful, but you gotta know how they work and not go overboard.
Good point. Now, no stew's complete without the perfect pairing. Sweet Adjeley suggests serving this with semolina fufu or banku. Those might not be familiar to all our listeners. Can you tell us about them?
Of course. Fufu and banku are starchy sides you see a lot in West African food. They're usually made from boiled and mashed root veggies or greens, which gives them a kind of doughy texture and a pretty mild flavor.
So they're perfect for soaking up all that flavorful stew. Seems like a classic example of how food pairings are often rooted in cultural traditions.
Absolutely. And the choice of semolina fufu is interesting. Semolina comes from durum wheat, and it gives a smoother, finer texture compared to other types of fufu.
Sounds like there's a whole world of fufu variations out there. But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's go back to Sweet Adjeley's video and talk about it.
Let's do it. I'm ready for more of this culinary adventure. So, Sweet Adjeley mentions her mom used to add a whole smoked fish to her okra stew.
A whole smoked fish. Wow, that's not something you see in recipes much these days.
Right. It really shows how connected this dish is to tradition and, using what you have. Imagine the flavor a whole smoked fish would add.
Yeah. You can almost taste it, that smoky, savory thing going through all the other flavors.
Hmm.
Makes me wonder what other variations are out there, like in different regions or even families.
Oh, for sure. You see regional differences all the time, even in the same country, like using different types of meat or seafood or veggies based on what's around.
Right, right.
It reminds you that recipes are always changing, adapting to different places and times.
So even something like okra stew, which seems pretty straightforward, can tell you about a culture's history, geography, all of that.
Absolutely.
Speaking of, I'm still thinking about those starchy sides, fufu and banku. You said they're made from boiled and mashed root veggies or grains. What are some examples?
Well, for fufu, you have some made from cassava, plantains, or yams. And banku is usually made from fermented corn and cassava dough. That fermenting process gives banku a slightly tangy taste.
So it's not just the ingredients, it's the techniques, too, that make these dishes unique. Pretty cool how much depth there is in what could seem like simple side dishes.
Yeah, it is.
And the texture of these sides, that's got to be just as important as the taste, right?
Definitely. They're meant to be soft and, well, pliable, so you can scoop up the stew and get all that delicious sauce.
Earlier you mentioned that semolina fufu is popular in Nigeria. Any particular reason for that? Just regional preference.
Could be historical reasons, like if wheat was more available in some areas, or maybe it's about cultural preferences for certain textures. Semolina fufu is usually smoother, finer, compared to fufu made from, say, root veggies.
Like each region has its own signature style, almost like a culinary fingerprint.
Yeah.
That makes you appreciate the diversity of a cuisine like West African, all the different
Well,
layers.
totally. It makes you want to branch out and try new flavors and textures. You never know what you might discover.
Now, I wanted to circle back to something Sweet Adjeley really emphasizes in her video, that drawly or slimy texture of okra stew. She even mentions a few ways to manage it.
Right, like adding more tomatoes to reduce the slime. She also says cooking it longer can have the same effect. It's really cool how she gives people the freedom to tweak the recipe to their liking.
Goes back to what we were talking about. Cooking isn't about strict rules. It's about understanding the ingredients and techniques so you can create something you really enjoy.
Exactly. It's great for home cooks to realize they can change the final dish, even one with so much tradition like okra stew.
Such a good point. Encourages people to experiment in the kitchen, make it their own. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one detail in Sweet Adjeley's video that really caught my eye.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What is it?
Well, throughout the video, she doesn't add any salt while actually cooking the stew. She seasons the meat really well during the pre-cooking step, but then she adds salt later when she's making the banku, but not when making fufu.
That's a detail I wouldn't have even thought about. It really shows her deep knowledge of flavor. Seasoning the meat early lets the flavor soak in, while adding salt to the banku boosts its own subtle flavor.
It's like she's composing the flavors, ensuring each part adds to the overall harmony of the dish. And that comes from years of experience, a deep understanding of her culinary background.
It's truly inspiring. It shows how cooking can be an art form, a way of expressing creativity and culture through taste and techniques.
So this deep dive into okra stew, it's been much more than just breaking down a recipe. It's been a look into another culture, a lesson in culinary skills, and an invitation to explore food with an open mind. What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the big thing here is that food's not just about eating to survive.
Right.
It reflects history, culture, personal stories even. Okra stew seems simple on the surface, but like we've been saying, there's so much meaning and tradition in it.
So true. Makes you realize you should approach any dish with curiosity and an open mind, right? Who knows what you might discover. And speaking of discoveries, there's one last thing I wanted to get to before we wrap things up.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we've talked a lot about that slimy texture of okra stew, how some people are into it and others not so much. From a cultural perspective, why do you think that texture shows up in some cuisines so much?
That's an interesting one. I think it goes back to how culinary traditions develop based on what ingredients are around and how people cook them.
Yeah.
In a lot of places, okra is a staple, and people see that unique texture as just part of the food.
So it's not just about taste, it's about what a culture accepts, even appreciates when it comes to texture.
Exactly. What might seem weird or unappealing to one group could be something they love in another. It reminds us to be open to trying new things, to challenge those ideas we have about food.
It makes me want to explore more cuisines and find those hidden gems that might seem a bit strange at first, but end up being totally delicious.
I'm with you there. Food's an adventure, and the more open we are to new flavors and textures, the more exciting that adventure gets.
Well said. So to wrap up our okra stew deep dive, I think we've found some really cool things. We learned about the science behind that unique texture, how to build layers of flavor, and the cultural significance of this dish. We even touched on some kitchen hacks and how to personalize recipes. Most importantly, though, I hope this made our listeners a little bit more curious.
Me too. I hope it encourages everyone to try new things, explore different cultures through food, and approach cooking with a sense of adventure and fun.
And who knows, maybe you'll even find your own happy dance moment in the kitchen.
Huh.
Until next time, happy cooking, everyone.